All right, welcome to, welcome to the second part of the learning unit. Last time we talked about classical conditioning with Pavlov's dogs. We talked about unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses, and conditioned stimuli and conditioned responses. We're going to change gears quite a bit today and start talking about operant conditioning. And this is the realm of B.F. Skinner. And we're going to be talking about voluntary behaviors. Classical conditioning deals with reflexes, reflexive behaviors, involuntary responses, and operant conditioning deals with more complex behaviors, things that we actually have control over. So let's begin. So, like I was saying, operant conditioning deals with the relationship between a behavior and a consequence. So, if I engage in a particular behavior, what is the consequence? Is it a pleasant consequence or is it an unpleasant consequence? Am I more likely to engage in that behavior or less likely to engage in that behavior? That's what we're looking at here. And again, this is voluntary behavior. These are behaviors that we have conscious control over. Now, before B.F. Skinner, we have Edward Thorndike. And Edward Thorndike can be considered sort of the grandfather of operant conditioning. If, if B.F. Skinner is the father, then Edward Thorndike is the grandfather. And Edward Thorndike is credited with the law of effect. The law of effect is pretty simple. The law of effect simply states if an organism engages in a behavior and the consequence of that behavior is pleasant, it is rewarded for that behavior, it is more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. So, if a behavior creates something pleasant, that behavior is more likely to occur again. And the opposite as well. Excuse me. If a behavior causes something unpleasant to happen, that particular behavior is less likely to occur in the future. So again, it's pretty simple. If something pleasant happens because of a behavior, it's more likely to occur in the future. If something unpleasant happens in the future as a consequence because of that behavior, it's less likely to happen in the future. This is the fundamental principle of operant conditioning. If we engage in something and we like the outcome, we're likely to do it again. All right, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. We're going to talk about very specific types of situations for controlling behavior, shaping behavior, to increase particular behaviors or decrease those particular behaviors. And we're going to start with the term reinforcer. Now, a reinforcer is something that increases the likelihood of a behavior occurring in the future. So a reinforcer is a pleasant thing. It could be a physical object, it could be an enjoyable activity, or it could be something like praise, verbal praise, social praise. Winning an award is an example of a reinforcer. So it's not a specific definition. A reinforcer could take many different forms. But at the end of the day, a reinforcer is something that increases the frequency of a particular behavior. Now, these reinforcers are variable. They're subjective. So candy could be a reinforcer. It could be a very powerful reinforcer, maybe for a young child. But maybe for an adult, it's still reinforcing, but just a little bit less so. Pizza is another great example. Let's think about your first slice of pizza at the end of a long day and you're really hungry. That piece probably tastes really freaking good. But maybe you have 3 or 4 pieces, and then that fifth piece, you're a little bit full, and all of a sudden that slice of pizza is not looking so good anymore. So the first slice of pizza was very reinforcing. But by the time you got to the fifth piece, you're a little satiated. All of a sudden, pizza is not very reinforcing anymore. So that's what I mean by these reinforcers are variable. In certain situations, one particular reinforcer may not be very powerful. In a different situation, it might be incredibly powerful. Money is another great example. I bet if you or I were walking down the street and we found $100 bill, that would just make our day. $100 is a nice little chunk of change. That is a wonderful thing to just put in your pocket. Now, let's say you are Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and you're walking down the street and there's $100 bill. Well, you might not even stop to pick up that $100 bill. Maybe it's a little muddy, a little dirty. You don't want to touch that dirty thing that's on the city sidewalk. So they might not even bother with that $100 because to them, that's like pennies. $100 to a very rich person is not a very powerful reinforcer. But $100 to someone who has an average income, that is a very reinforcing stimulus. So that idea of satiation down there, this is the idea that the more you present a particular reinforcer, the less reinforcing that thing becomes. The more money you have, the less reinforcing money becomes. The more pizza you have, the less reinforcing pizza becomes. The more candy you have, the less pleasant eating candy becomes. So these reinforcers are highly, highly variable. They vary between situations and they vary between individuals. All right, so we've laid the groundwork for what a reinforcer is. It's this kind of nebulous, ever-changing thing. And we're going to talk about some specific conditions, some specific techniques to modify behavior. And that's kind of the nitty-gritty here. That's the whole purpose of operant conditioning, is how can we use these principles to influence behavior? Kind of laid the basic groundwork here. Something pleasant happens, we're likely to increase the frequency of a behavior. Something unpleasant happens, we're likely to see that particular behavior decrease. And in the realm of operant conditioning, we're going to talk about 4 different behavior modification techniques. And these 4 techniques are on 2 dimensions. One of those dimensions is the reinforcement or punishment scale, and the other is the positive and negative scale. And we're going to talk about what those words mean specifically coming up here. All right, so we've got reinforcement. That's one of our dimensions here. Reinforcement means that you are increasing a particular behavior, and that's why this arrow is pointing up. You're increasing a behavior when you're using reinforcement. All right, so we've got 2 different types of reinforcement. We've got positive reinforcement, and then we'll talk about in just a second, negative reinforcement. All right, so positive reinforcement, let's break this down. It's reinforcement, so we are increasing, or at least attempting to increase the frequency of a behavior, and it's positive. Positive means that we are adding a stimulus. We are adding something pleasant after that behavior has occurred. So a real quick example, you're training your dog to sit and you tell them sit, they sit, you give them a treat. That treat is reinforcing. The positive part there was the addition of the treat. Reinforcement means that the dog is more likely to sit on command in the future because something pleasant happened after that behavior. So positive reinforcement. Positive means something is added. Reinforcement means the behavior increases in frequency. Now let's contrast this with negative reinforcement. This is our other form of reinforcement. It is still reinforcement, so we're still increasing a behavior, but this time we are taking something away. And now, if we want to take something away and still increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring, This means we are going to take away something unpleasant, maybe something painful. So let's say, again, you're training your dog and maybe you're using a shock collar. I don't personally recommend shock collars, but they are useful training tools. So let's say the dog is doing something that it's not supposed to be doing. Maybe it's running away. You tell it to come back and it's not listening. So you apply the shock. You push the button on the remote, the shock is given, and all of a sudden the dog comes sprinting back to you. And when they come back to you, you stop shocking them. So you remove the painful shock, and that makes it more likely for them to come back to you in the future when their name is called. So this is one that is very tricky. We're going to go through several examples of negative reinforcement, but this is the one that students struggle with the most. And I know it's because of this word right here, negative. Negative does not mean bad. It just means you're taking something away. And again, it's reinforcement, so we're trying to increase the frequency of behavior. So you're taking away something bad. When you see these words positive and negative, don't think good and bad. Think positive means adding something, negative means taking something away. All right, let's talk a little bit more about reinforcers. Reinforcers, again, these are things that make it more likely for a behavior to occur in the future. These are pleasant things, pleasant events, pleasant activities. We have primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Excuse me. A primary reinforcer is something that is inherently pleasant. These are reinforcers that do not have to be learned that they are pleasant. So a primary reinforcer is something that we are born with the knowledge, knowing this is a good thing. Food, when we are hungry, is a primary reinforcer. Water, when we're thirsty, is a primary reinforcer. A secondary reinforcer is something that has to be learned. A secondary reinforcer is something that is reinforcing only because it is associated with a primary reinforcer. You may be getting some classical conditioning vibes from the relationship here. Secondary reinforcers are basically like conditioned stimuli. Primary reinforcers are unconditioned stimuli. All right, so a couple examples. Secondary reinforcers. These are most likely the most common reinforcers we come across in our daily life. So money. Money is a great example of a secondary reinforcer. Money in and of itself is not reinforcing, but the fact that we can use money to gain primary reinforcers, that's what makes money reinforcing. If you think about it, money is just a piece of paper or numbers in a bank account. But the fact that you can use that money to get food, or you can use that money to buy a nice house or nice clothes or a nice car, that's what makes money reinforcing. So money is only reinforcing because it's associated with primary reinforcers. Another example, a slice of pizza when you're hungry is a primary reinforcer, but the smell of pizza is a secondary reinforcer. The smell of pizza is only reinforcing because it's associated with an actual slice of pizza. So if you smell pizza and you're hungry, that is reinforcing. But again, that's not reinforcing in and of itself. That's only reinforcing because we usually think of an actual slice of pizza when we smell it. Another great example comes from animal training. Some of you may be familiar with clickers. It's just a tiny little device, a little handheld device. And when you push the button, it makes a clicking noise. Kind of like those old school like Snapple pop tops. I don't know if anyone knows what I'm talking about, but they make a loud clicking noise whenever you depress the center of them. So what animal trainers do is they spend a lot of time making the animal, whether it's a dog or a cat or whatever, associating that clicking noise with something pleasant. Usually it's just a treat. So over and over and over again, you click the button, give a treat. Click the button, give a treat. Click the button, give a treat. And before long, the animal learns that that clicking sound is reinforcing in and of itself. So the clicker becomes reinforcing as a secondary reinforcer because it is associated with the primary reinforcer of the tasty treat, the little Scooby snack. And these are great. Clickers are great because they give us the ability to extend training sessions, specifically because they avoid satiation. If you've ever tried to train a dog, it's difficult, but it is possible that the dog will eventually get full on those treats. You can only train for so long if every time the dog does something good, you give it a treat. Before long, that treat is going to lose its reinforcing power because the dog gets full. And when you're full, food is not reinforcing. So if instead of giving a treat every time the dog does something good, let's say you click the button and maybe you only give a treat once every 5 times the dog does something good, that click is going to be just as reinforcing, just as powerful of a reinforcer as that little treat is. So that's secondary reinforcers. And then I want to briefly talk about shaping. So shaping is modifying behavior in a small step-by-step progression. This is sometimes called progressive reinforcing. So we can actually create seemingly complex behaviors in animals using the techniques of shaping. So what you do in shaping, let's say you want to have a dog perform a little trick and jump through a hoop. And that is exactly the trick that is being taught in the video that is linked on the Canvas page. I highly recommend you watch that video at the end of this slide. It's going to be a great example of what shaping is. So let's say you want to train a dog to jump through a little hoop, a little hula hoop. That's not something the dog is going to do immediately. That's not something the dog is going to do right away. So what you do is you first train the dog to get near the hula hoop that you want it to jump through. So you do that by holding the hula hoop and kind of encouraging the dog to approach it. And every time they get close to it, you either click the button or give them a treat. Both of those things are reinforcing. So you give them a treat when they get close to the hula hoop. And you do that a couple times, and then before long, you have to up your standards. So now you give them a treat only when they put 1 foot through the hula hoop. So now they're approaching the hula hoop and they realize that approaching the hula hoop is not reinforcing anymore. They have to do something else. What do they have to do? They try to figure it out. So now they have to approach the hula hoop and put 1 foot through. And every time they do that, you give them a treat. You give them a treat. You give them a treat. And you do that for several times. And then eventually you make them put 2 feet through the hula hoop before you give them a treat. Before long, they learn that. And then before long, you have them put both their back feet through the hula hoop. All right, now you've got them to the point where they are walking through the hula hoop. Now you start shaping the behavior of jumping through it. So you raise the hula hoop off the ground. And again, you reinforce anytime they kind of hop through the hula hoop. And in this slow kind of progressive reinforcing way, you can create some very complex behaviors through these tiny little baby steps. And that's, again, exactly what's happening in that video that's linked on the Canvas page. You can do this with lots of different animal tricks, things like rolling over. If you're a researcher and you need to train a rat to press a lever in a cage, this is exactly the technique that is used, shaping. So it's kind of just like individually reinforcing tiny little components of an overall complex behavior. All right, so up until now, we've been talking about reinforcers, reinforcement, increasing the likelihood of a behavior occurring. Now we're going to start talking about punishment. And a punisher is the exact opposite of a reinforcer. So a punisher is anything that will decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring. So a punisher is something unpleasant. A punisher could be something painful, something that makes us nauseous, something that makes us sad, any number of things that again would make a behavior less likely to occur in the future. And just like reinforcers, this could be something actual, a physical object. It could be an activity. It could be like social condemnation. It could take many forms. And just like reinforcers, they are variable. So something that is a punisher to one person in one particular context might not be a punisher in a completely different context. Now, once again, we've got our 4 different behavior modification techniques based on these 2 different dimensions. We've got reinforcement and punishment, and then we've got positive and negative. We briefly talked about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and now we're going to talk about positive punishment and negative punishment. So, once again, it's really important that you guys have a good handle on these terms here. Reinforcement means you're increasing the likelihood of a behavior. Punishment means you're decreasing the likelihood of a behavior. Positive means that you're adding a stimulus. Negative means that you're taking a stimulus away. So let's break this down. Positive punishment. It's punishment, so we're trying to decrease a behavior. And it's positive, which means we're adding something. How do you decrease behavior by adding something? You add something unpleasant. Maybe it's a painful shock. Maybe it's a slap on the wrist. Maybe it's any number of things. Positive means you're adding something. Punishment means you're decreasing that behavior. So positive punishment means you're adding something unpleasant to the organism to sort of stop them from doing that behavior anymore. Now let's move on to negative punishment. Once again, it's punishment, so we're trying to decrease the behavior, but this time it's negative, so we're taking something away. How do you take something away and still create a punishment? You take away something pleasant, something that the organism desires. You take away food when they're hungry. You take away water when they're thirsty. A great example of this would be fines. Think of like a parking ticket. What does a parking ticket do? It takes your money away. It takes your 30, 40, 50 bucks away. That makes you less likely to park in that particular spot again in the future. So positive punishment, you're adding something unpleasant to make it less likely for the organism to engage in that behavior in the future. Negative punishment, you're taking away something positive to make it less likely that that organism engages in that future behavior. All right, couple quick examples here. Drunk driving. This is a behavior that we want to decrease in society as much as possible. It's dangerous behavior. It puts other people's lives at risk. And it's obviously something that we want to see less of on our public roads. So we can decrease this behavior in 2 different ways, positive punishment or negative punishment. Positive punishment, we're adding something unpleasant. This could be